Welcome everyone, I'm Cody Koch. On my channel we talk about investing, trading, and business concepts. This is one of my question and answer videos in which people ask me a question, I give them an answer via video. Let's get to it. Cody, how do you decide what a business is worth? Okay, so this question's a little bit more complicated, and I will try to simplify this as much as possible. There are four major ways to value a business. I prefer one above all others, but I actually do use all four from time to time depending on the situation. Now these four ways work for small and medium-sized businesses, so from small mom and pops all the way up to very large publicly traded businesses. So the first method is the liquidation value method. In general, liquidation value is used when you're trying to figure out what a business would sell for or what it would be worth if it failed completely. Let's say, for example, we go to loan money on a business and we're going to use the assets of that business as collateral for our loan. We would use liquidation value to figure out what those assets may be worth. For example, you can have accounts receivable in the business. Typically, it means you have to kind of give them a haircut in which you discount those accounts receivable by a certain amount. Oftentimes, it's something like 20% or 30%, and then whatever the number. So if a business has $1 million in accounts receivable, you may have it at $800,000 in accounts receivable, $700,000 in accounts receivable. In case of inventory, that can be anywhere from 50% discount to as much as 80% discount, or in some cases, the work in process inventory may be worthless. Then of course you have liquidation value of used equipment and so forth. And so you take that all together, you get an idea of what the business would sell for. If there's any digital assets or intangible assets that might actually have liquidation value, those would be factored in, of course, as well. That's how you get a liquidation value of a business. Typically, in my case, I use liquidation value primarily is to kind of have a rough idea what the floor would be for this business. So if we acquired the business and it failed, what would be the absolute lowest cash we might be able to get out of the business in the worst case scenario? Number two is replacement cost. Now, replacement cost is very unusual. A lot of people are not using this system, and it's used in certain circumstances in certain areas. So replacement cost is the idea of how much money would we have to put out in order to start equivalent business and get it to this level of sales and profits that it's currently at. Replacement cost is kind of tricky because you actually have to have a lot of experience in the industry to truly be able to analyze and understand all the moving parts and all the things that would be needed to make a business from scratch become as profitable as a business that may have been in business for 10 or 20 years. So in the case of replacement cost, in general, what you do is you not only figure out what the assets would cost to buy them, either in used condition or possibly new condition in some cases, but you also need to figure out the intangibles. For example, how much money would it cost to build the brand image and the brand equity of that business? How much money would it cost to develop the brand awareness? And generally, you would have to do things like 3 to 5 years worth of advertising expense to even get close to roughly estimating how much it would cost to create a brand like that. Trying to figure out how much it would cost to develop a new technology or get equivalent patent or something like that. All of this is very tricky within the replacement cost valuation. So when you would use replacement cost, obviously insurance companies are typically the biggest users of replacement cost valuations, but it can also be used when we're evaluating businesses to acquire. For example, let's say we go evaluate a business, we find out that business is currently making $1 million a year in earnings, and the seller is asking, let's say, $3 million for this business. But if we dug into replacement cost, we may discover we can very confidently create the exact same business and produce roughly the same amount of profits for, let's say, $1 million. I have seen a number of cases in which a business can relatively be replaced at a much cheaper cost than that same business is currently being sold for. But again, we have to be very careful with using replacement cost. It generally requires a lot of knowledge and experience about an industry in order to utilize replacement cost valuation correctly. The third is cash flow value, or often referred to as earnings power value. This one's by far the most important. It's the most commonly used. It's the one I use most. Cash flow, in fact, is the main reason anybody really wants to own a business in the long run. So obviously being able to evaluate that cash flow is super important. There are two major ways to use cash flow valuation. The most mathematical method, if you will, is the discounted cash flow model, which is commonly used, especially in a lot of academic circles, and it works pretty well. But a much shorter, quick-hand version is what's called simply the cash flow multiple. Now, cash flow multiples are far more common. You see this in many industries. The way you use cash flow multiples is you go out and you get something, let's say, business reference guide, which is used as the business brokerage industry and investment banking industry, in which they compile a lot of data about businesses and what they're currently selling for as a multiple of their cash flow. So typically you'll find small and medium-sized businesses will sell anywhere from about 1 to 5 times their EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Whereas large publicly traded companies will often sell for anywhere from 8 to 15 times EBITDA. One of the most common pricing methods is to simply go find the multiples most common for a particular industry. Some industries sell at very low multiples, other industries sell at very high multiples. And so what we do is we reference something like Business Reference Guide, for example. We look at the multiple multiple ranges that are out there for a particular industry, and then we compare those multiples to what a business is currently selling for and what multiple it's currently selling for. So in that respect, it's very similar to doing real estate comps, in which we're comparing similar businesses in the same industry. Okay, and fourth is growth value. Now, growth value I rarely use. I actually use this the least of all, and the reason I use growth value so little is because growth is actually very speculative in many cases. There's a big question mark around it. We went out and acquired a business, then we try to grow it. It's usually very expensive and it's risky. A lot of time growth does not necessarily bear fruit. For that reason, growth value, when I use it, it's usually on large publicly traded companies, and typically I use growth value when I see significant pricing power in which the business appears that it may actually have monopoly-like pricing, or it has some kind of very strong, sustainable competitive advantage. Now that said, I have found a number of cases in which sellers will try to sell the business based on growth value, but like I said, that's very risky, and it's typically not very common in the business acquisition world of small and medium-sized businesses to acquire businesses based upon much growth at all. For us, growth value is more of a margin of safety. It helps protect us during an acquisition. Now, I do need to say this, and I've learned this over time, is that the valuation method used is often highly dependent upon the financing and deal terms for a particular acquisition. So for example, if a seller wants to sell us a business and wants all cash at closing, the price we can pay for that, the multiple of cash flow, if you will, is very different than in, let's say, a seller said, look, I will accept 100% seller financing. I will finance you 100% of the business for the next 100 years, but I want 50 times earning. Believe it or not, that's actually a fair deal. And the deciding factor is how much cash flow is left over after everybody's paid, including the seller of the business, debt holders, the bank, investors. After everybody's paid, how much cash flow is left over is the major defining factor in how businesses are valued by us. So what's interesting is we can use a wide variety of financial engineering and deal engineering, if you will, in order to make the pie bigger for the seller as well as for ourselves. If you found this interesting, please click that like button and subscribe and check out one of these other videos. Thank you for watching.